Well, it was a great week for African leaders, especially Nigeria, as the United States President Joe Biden has hailed President Muhammadu Buhari for his efforts in deepening democracy, not only in Nigeria, but also in Africa. Well, the U.S. President spoke in Washington, D.C., while meeting with leaders of 6 African countries billed to have elections in 2023 on the sidelines of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit taking place in the U.S. Capitol. Well, according to Biden, the meeting with select African leaders, including those of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Liberia, Madagascar, and Sierra Leone, was to discuss elections and democracy in Africa, share experiences with the United States on the forthcoming elections. This is also the White House. The White House pledges $55 billion in economic health and security support for Africa over the next 3 years. What benefits actually does this hold for Nigeria in the wake of the general elections coming up in less than 72 days? All right, you're still watching This Week. To discuss the U.S.-Africa Summit is Professor Jideofor Adibe and Oscar Ossai joining us from Lagos studio. But of course, Professor Jideofor is here. Gentlemen, both of you are welcome to the program. I'd like to start with you, Professor Jideofor Adibe, who is in the studio here with me. I'll come to you in the course of the program in Lagos. But all right, Jideofor, this was, I gather, to reboot U.S.-Africa relations on the continent. I'd ask you, how far did this go in terms of its objective?
Well, thank you very much. It's too early to know the extent to which the objectives. We know there have been commitment of $55 billion over 3 years, sorry. And what is important is that this is coming 8 years after the first U.S.-Africa summit was launched by Barack Obama. Some people have questioned whether there is really anything that the U.S. is going to offer that is not being offered by several other Africa summits. You have the one with France, we have the one with Russia, you have the one with India, and China, the famous FOCAC, which is actually in its 8th round. Well, is this just a talking shop, a photo op? There are 2 ways to look at it. What are the stated objectives? All those stated objectives: improve trade, and they massage the ego of African leaders when he told them that Africa is going to shape the world. That's a feel-good one. But in terms of whether it's just a photo op, I think there's something positive. After the wilderness years of Donald Trump, that this is coming in the just barely 2nd year. It's something, laudable. We have to also say that's something, to be commended. And usually, U.S. global presidents or U.S. presidents or UK prime minister, they think of Africa only towards the end of their tenure. So the fact that Biden is bringing this up just 2nd year into his own presidency is in consonance with the fact that he's trying, if you look at his own cabinet, how he tries to, bring in minority. That may be one. It is also possible that it is indirectly addressing the question of Ukraine, Russian intervention in Ukraine, and the resurgent China, which is trying to deal with, and that there is now a competition over narrative in terms of how do we manage to get Africa on our side. And this is very instructive, because if you take notes, after the Ukraine war broke out in March, when the UN tried to condemn the invasion, 17 African countries abstained. Again in April, when they tried to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, 19 African countries abstained. In October again, the UN General Assembly tried to condemn Russia's annexation of 5 territories. Again, 19 African countries led by Nigeria also abstained. So it is possible that it's a way of trying to bring Africa closer to its own side.
All right. quite interesting analysis there with African countries of abstaining, whether America now, whether it's, what would you call it, a bargaining point by Africans or African leaders to get America to look towards Africa. Oscar, Jidofor just said something quite poignant. He said some have questioned whether this is a talking shop or a photo op, or is it real? That's one question. And let me add this to that, whether it's a Photoshop or a photo opportunity. Well, this has been described as the most substantial commitment by the U.S. administration to boost its influence in Africa. You know, why is America doing this, and how should African leaders take it? Oscar.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening, fellow countrymen and women and people of the world. First of all, I commend the fact that America is looking this way. I was at one of the most attended Christian gospel programs, The Experience, a few days back, and the American envoy who came there told us plainly that we need to know that America depends on Nigeria. I mean, it was a strange conversation, but he followed it up by saying that he's serious. We need to begin to understand that God has positioned Africa. We need to begin to understand that it's no longer a joke that China has reached out to Africa. This meeting that the President of the United States had with African leaders, the Chinese leader also had one. Now, the fact of the matter also is, if you look at sports, France has just defeated another country, and all the players that France featured were African footballers. Let us begin to know that Africa has come of age. Let us begin to know that Africa is the resource base of the world in terms of materials for running industries. Let us begin to know that the size of Africa is more than the size of America, Europe, and almost China put together. Let's begin to know that all the resources in the world is domiciled in this continent. And these nations come here to source whatever they need to do their primary productions. So what I'm saying is that America actually has no choice than to look this way. And maybe as the conversation continues, I will say that I personally am not impressed. I'm not impressed because if we have solid leadership in Africa, we should no longer be looking for pittance from these nations. We should no longer be looking for handouts. We have sufficient resources and the brain power to run nations in Africa that will put Western nations to task about development. These are my views on this.
I'm not impressed. Well, when Oscar says I'm not impressed, I was wondering, not impressed on the side of America or not impressed on the side of African leaders. African leaders seem to, in that summit, place demands instead of even going cap in hand. I'm sure, Jidofor, you noticed that. But let's bring in the fact that the $55 billion support plan, is it enough? Too little? Or a step in the right direction? Oscar, I'm asking, Jidofor, I'll come back to you if you want to chip in on that. A step in the right direction.
Okay, no problem.
Which one is it? Enough, too little, or a step in the right direction, Jidofor?
Well, it is multi-sectoral. It's spread over several sectors. So we wouldn't really know. But let me say this. While we criticize some of the shortcomings in America's foreign policy, especially towards Africa, we should also be able to recognize a few things that they've done well. One of them was the PEPFAR, the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is the most a plan that committed the most resource globally for one disease. And it is true that as of this year they've spent $110 billion supporting AIDS relief, and it was actually through their intervention that all those rapid mortalities from people suffering from HIV, was stemmed. So we give them credit in that. AGOA also, had recorded some successes, and which needs to be pepped up. They also talked about giving 110 million to, as a framework to supporting military aid and all that. So it's all very well distributed. Some will work well, some will not. For example, if you look at under Obama pledged Light Up Africa, which a project he wanted to use to light up 590 million households, give them electricity. It was meant to generate 30,000 megawatts of electricity. As of today, that was 8 years ago, it has only managed to generate 6,500. So it's often too early. These are just commitments, and a commitment is a commitment. It takes supply side and demand side. There are often things that African countries need to do to be able, to crystallize the benefits. If you look at AGOA, some of the reasons why Nigeria, for example, has not been able to tap fully the opportunities is because of quality. They have not been able to measure up with the quality. So there are sides, things on the part of Africa that need to be fixed. But whatever happens, what we are looking for is for Africa to drop its begging bowl, to get over this begging bowl syndrome, that whenever it goes abroad, it seems to be mired in a complex. And before you say Jack Robinson is begging for one thing or the other.
All right, let me bring you in, Ossai. I hope we'll have enough time to address the question of Russia and China's influence on the continent of Africa, and where America is in on this. But the tactics by America this time is no longer criticism of China, of Russia, but rather its partnership with Africa. What America can offer to Africa. These are the words of Jake Sullivan, Biden's security advisor. Now that sounds interesting. I don't know how you want to look at it, but because partnership means you have something, we have something, we want to come together. It's not like I'm feeding you. So Oscar, I don't know how you want to look at that.
Yeah, you see, that's the same point I was trying to advance. Look, the reality is that today's world, where we're talking about big data, where we're talking about connectivity, where we're talking about artificial intelligence, the world is advancing at such a high speed. African leadership needs to wake up. We can no longer continue to depend on this uneducated, unenlightened, and unaggressive leadership we have in Africa. The fact of the matter is that America has no choice in a market-denominated economy than to look for partnership. How big is this market in Africa? Africa, look, we're not talking about Nigeria alone. We're talking about the whole of Africa. What is the population strength of Africa? It is the poverty syndrome that is making this market look like it is small. It's one of the biggest markets in the world. So today, the world, nations of the world are emphasizing population size, market consciousness, and such issues. So America has no choice than to begin to look this way. How many Nigerian professionals are working in America at a very high level? How many Nigerian, I looked at a certain school that just graduated some nurses in the UK. I think they said they graduated about, I can't remember the exact number, but more than 90% of the graduates were Nigerians. So you can imagine the amount of money that is leaving Africa into Western Europe and North America for education purposes. What about health visits of the people? So what I'm saying is that it is not out of place that a wise president should be looking for where they can invest and have returns on their investments that make sense. And Africa is that place today. Good. So they are doing what they should do. But the other side to it is we now expect an intellectual intellectually based leadership in Africa that can take advantage of these situations. You remember that this same America provided the Marshall Plan, which could developed Europe after the Second World War. What was the total figure of the amount of money invested in the Marshall Plan? It was only about $555 billion. So what I'm saying is that if they could provide such to redevelop Europe, they can also do much more in Africa. However, I am even saying that we do not really need their money. What we need is to organize our leadership, to manage our resources better, and we can compete at par with these nations. This is the approach I expect to see. So they are not doing anything unusual. America should begin to look this way. It is said that in less than 15 years from now, Nigeria will have the highest population in any nation can expect to have.
We don't have all the time. World. Yeah. Oscar says, uneducated. I wonder whether you're not being too hard on our leaders. Uneducated, unenlightened leadership that we have. I don't know how Jidelfo wants to look at that. But I promise to bring this. We don't have any more time. I don't know whether we have maybe about 1 or 2 minutes, Jidelfo. Is America trying to push back, aggressively on Russia and China, rather than having the interest of Africa at heart? What do you think?
Well, I think it's not, I mean, foreign policy is driven by a national interest, self-interest. So, but within, as the other partner negotiates its own interest, you can also locate your own interest there. Yes, there is a need to contain China. There is a need by US to contain a resurgent Russia. What we could have also tabled at the summit. We have been demanding for 2 representations at the United Nations Security Council. It is a time for us to do a quid pro quo. Say, look, you give us this, yes, we can vote for you. Look at the position Iran and Saudi took. So it's the system is also structurally disadvantaging Africa. You can negotiate it by saying, okay, reduce the non-tariff barriers that makes it difficult for some African countries to tap the benefits of AGOA, and then we will vote for you. We will condemn Russia. I mean, you don't outrightly say you will, because you leave up room to also be able to trade with the other side when circumstances change. But I think that forum presents an opportunity to make concrete demands, and there are several demands African countries will make. And for you to make that demand effectively, you have to negotiate from a position of strength. Right now, we are negotiating from a position of relative weakness.
All right, we're operating from a pedestal of relative weakness is what you have to offer that determines what you can bring to the table in terms of your strength and capacity and bargaining power. But Oscar, before we let 2 of you go, what do you make of Biden's praise of the president? He says to deepen democracy, not just within the shores of the country here in Nigeria, but outside the shores of the country in Africa.
Well, you see, when presidents talk, we who are analysts, we need to look at what they are saying in the context of what we are seeing on ground. I don't know what President Biden saw that amounts to deepening democracy. I am not saying yes or no to his statement. I'm just saying that we need to know the index or the indices he's using to compare deepening democracies so that we can be on the same page with him. A lot of us in Nigeria are we are barely surviving. So until we know what he means by deepening democracy, it may be difficult to discuss it.
The president has said he will make sure that he leaves behind a fair, transparent election. I mean that must be the basis. And of course, he also said that the president is not seeking for a 3rd term. Of course, we know what he was referring to. These were the 2 bases, I believe, why he said what he had to say.
Okay, if we are talking about If we're talking about bequeathing the nation with a credible election, we can look at that as his legacy as he moves on. But not until we see that, we are holding our hands crossed, watching to see that before we can give him our praises. So that's why I'm saying, until what the Biden stood on to make that comment is known, we cannot discuss it.
Probably say you're being like Thomas, who would love to see before he believes. Thank you so much, Oscar Ossai. Professor Jidel, for
seeing is believing.
Yeah, that's what you're doing. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being on the program.